The check was for $4,217. That was what Eddie Morrow was owed when Meridian Logistics let him go. 3 weeks of final wages, unused vacation, and a safety bonus he had earned after 12 incident-free months on a route most people in the city never knew existed. 5 days after Meridian stopped answering his calls. 3 hospitals were facing a medication emergency. And before the city understood what had gone wrong, the CEO who had refused to release Eddie's final check would need the one driver he had already decided was replaceable. Eddie did not know any of that when he walked out of Meridian for the last time. He only knew that his rent was due. His daughter Kezia's school registration deadline was getting closer, and the company that had used 11 years of his life had told him to wait. Eddie Morrow was 53 years old. He had driven delivery trucks since he was old enough to qualify for the commercial license. Before Meridian, he had spent 10 years moving freight for a national carrier until the company shut down its regional division and gave hundreds of drivers a letter, a date, and no useful plan beyond that. Eddie had learned early that a job could disappear without warning. He had also learned that panic did not improve a decision. So he found the next job. He paid the bills. He maintained the old sedan he bought with cash. He replaced its brake lines one summer, its alternator one winter, and the water pump on a Saturday when Kezia was 8 and watched him hand over tools from the driveway. He did not love working on cars. He loved the fact that the car started every morning. In Eddie's world, reliability was not a personality trait. It was a form of care. Kezia was 14 now. She lived mostly with her mother, but every other weekend she stayed with Eddie in his third-floor apartment, where there was always too much coffee in the kitchen and a stack of library books on the table, because she was the kind of girl who could lose an entire afternoon inside a subject once it caught her attention. She had earned a place in a magnet program across town. Eddie had been saving for the registration fee since February. Every payday, even when the amount was small, he moved something into the envelope he kept in the kitchen drawer. He had written Kezia on the front in block letters. He never mentioned the envelope to her. He wanted the payment to arrive as a fact, not as a burden she had to feel grateful for. He was not famous. He was not the kind of man people invited on stage at company meetings. He did not want to be. For 11 years, he had driven Meridian's hospital route. Every workday, his alarm rang at 4:30. He made coffee in the dark, checked the weather, pulled on his work clothes, and drove to the pharmaceutical distribution center while most apartment windows in the city were still black. By 6 in the morning, he was at Mercy General. By 7, he was at Harmon Specialty Clinic. By 8:30, he was backing carefully through the narrow south approach at the Pediatric Care Center, a turn that looked simple to anyone who had never tried to make it with a loaded truck and a concrete barrier close enough to punish a small mistake. Eddie knew every part of the route. He knew Mercy General's receiving buzzer did not reach the back room, so he knocked 3 times on the door. He knew Harmon's freight elevator needed 30 seconds on cold mornings before the door mechanism stopped fighting you. He knew the Pediatric Care Center approach had been narrowed after a resurfacing project, and that 2 inexperienced drivers had already clipped the barrier before anyone put the warning into an official manual. He knew which medication totes had to stay cold. He knew which pharmacists wanted the paperwork handed over before the carts rolled inside. He knew what time the overnight teams changed shifts. He knew the small things that never appeared on a spreadsheet, and the small things were the reason the route worked. In the cab of his truck, Eddie kept a 3-inch binder. It contained dock codes, route notes, delivery windows, equipment quirks, emergency contacts, approach diagrams, and the careful handwriting of a man who understood that systems fail first in the places where nobody thinks to look. Eddie updated that binder for 11 years. Meridian never asked him to. That was the point. The binder existed because Eddie had watched what happened when people relied on memory alone. A dock code changed. A new driver was not told. A cart sat outside in rain. A freight elevator failed when the temperature dropped. A pharmacist went home sick and the substitute did not know who could sign the receiving form. None of these were dramatic failures by themselves. They were small points of friction. But enough friction, repeated often enough, became a breakdown. Eddie had never used words like operational continuity. He would have found them too polished. He called it writing things down. And because he wrote things down, the route had run for 11 years without a serious interruption. No executive ever asked how. No one in corporate operations had ever sat in the cab with him at 4:30 in the morning, watched him make the same turns, or heard the names people used when they were tired and needed a delivery to arrive before the pharmacy opened. But the route worked. That was all anyone saw. The company had been sold in June. The new owner was Veriton Supply Solutions, a large logistics firm that acquired regional companies, consolidated their contracts, and called the resulting layoffs efficiency. Their new CEO, Warren Holt, was 46, polished, ambitious, and known inside the company for a phrase he had used in a trade interview: aggressive value recovery. The phrase sounded good in a presentation. It sounded less good to the 14 people who lost their jobs 3 weeks after he arrived. Eddie was one of them. The HR representative who told him was young enough to look uncomfortable reading the script. She said his position had been eliminated as part of a route optimization plan. She said his final check would be processed through the normal payroll cycle. She said there might be a short delay while the company centralized its records. What she did not say was that Warren Holt had issued a consolidation directive during the acquisition. No manual exceptions for departing employees until time records had been cleared through the new centralized payroll system. It sounded like a safeguard. In practice, it meant that anyone caught between the old company and the new one could wait indefinitely while no individual person had to say no directly. Eddie asked whether the final pay could be expedited. He explained that he had no income after Friday. He explained that the check included money he had set aside for his daughter's school registration. He explained it calmly because calm was the way he spoke when something mattered. The representative told him she would ask payroll. She never got back to him. On his last day, Eddie drove the hospital route exactly as he always had. At Mercy General, Patricia from the overnight pharmacy waited by the receiving door. She handed him the paperwork, then held his hand an extra second when he said goodbye. "You kept us running," she said. At Harmon, the freight elevator stalled once, as it always did on cold mornings. Eddie waited 30 seconds. The doors opened. The carts rolled through. At the pediatric care center, Jerome was waiting by the loading bay in a fluorescent vest. Jerome managed logistics for the children's hospital. His nephew had been treated there years earlier. He took every delivery personally because, in his mind, every box that came off Eddie's truck eventually reached a child whose family was waiting for something to go right. When Eddie told him it was his last day, Jerome looked toward the truck, then back at Eddie. "Who's taking the route?" he asked. "Company says they have coverage," Eddie said. Jerome nodded, but not with confidence. At the Meridian Depot that afternoon, Eddie turned in his key card, his ID badge, and the binder. The operations supervisor took the binder in one hand. He did not open it. He placed it on a shelf beside a stack of unused safety manuals. Eddie watched him do it. Then he walked out. He drove home slowly, not because he had nowhere to be, but because the route had always given his day a shape, and now the hours in front of him felt unfinished. At a red light, he looked at the passenger seat where his binder used to ride every morning. For years it had been there beside him, thick and ordinary looking, its pages bent from use. Now it was on a shelf inside a company that had decided it had no further use for him. He did not know that it would stay unopened. For the first week after Eddie left, Meridian sent a rotating relief driver to cover parts of the hospital route. One day, the driver reached Mercy General but missed Harmon. Another day, the pediatric care center received a partial shipment late in the afternoon. The relief driver had a printed manifest and a GPS route. He did not have Eddie's binder. He did not know the dock codes, the elevator rule, or which calls to make when a receiving bay did not answer. The hospitals complained. The complaints entered a customer service queue. Then the relief driver was reassigned to a higher volume contract. The administrator responsible for replacing him had been laid off during the same restructuring that eliminated Eddie. The route remained marked as active in Meridian's system. In reality, it had no owner. Meanwhile, Eddie waited for his money. After 10 days, the check had not arrived. HR sent him to payroll. Payroll said the final check was awaiting review because of a timesheet discrepancy. Eddie asked what the discrepancy was. No one could tell him. He left voicemails. He sent emails. He visited the office twice. By the end of the second week, he had received 3 different answers from 3 different people. The check had been processed, the check was under review, and the check could not be released without executive authorization. That last answer came from Warren Holt's executive assistant. By then, Eddie had counted the calls: 6 voicemails, 4 emails, 2 visits to the office. He had kept the times in a small notebook because he had learned that details were worth more when you could put them in order. The people he reached were not cruel. That almost made it worse. They were polite in the way people can be polite while doing nothing. One person said the issue had been escalated. Another said it had been assigned. A third said the payroll team was handling a backlog created by the acquisition. Every answer meant the same thing: wait. Eddie had gone to Meridian headquarters on a Thursday morning and asked, politely, to speak with the CEO. He did not raise his voice at the security desk. He did not make a scene. He simply explained that he had been waiting for final pay, that he had received no usable explanation, and that he needed someone with authority to tell him what was happening. The assistant returned from a back office 10 minutes later. She said Mr. Holt would not authorize an exception until payroll had completed the review. Eddie asked how long the review would take. She said she did not know. That was the moment he understood the delay was no longer an administrative mistake. It was a decision. He walked back to his car and sat in the parking lot with both hands resting on the steering wheel. He had promised Kezia he would cover the registration fee for the magnet school program she had worked hard to get into. She was 14. She liked biology and mathematics. She had the same steady way of concentrating that Eddie recognized in people who could stay with a difficult problem longer than everyone else. The fee was not enormous, but after rent, gas, groceries, and 2 weeks without income, it was more than he could lose. Eddie called his sister Renata. Renata had spent 20 years helping workers navigate wage disputes. She did not romanticize the system. She knew what companies counted on: that people would be tired, confused, busy, embarrassed, or too broke to fight over money they had already earned. She listened while Eddie explained the missing check, the timesheet discrepancy nobody could define, and the assistant's message from the CEO. When he finished, she said, "They are counting on you not knowing the rules." Eddie looked through the windshield at Meridian's glass building. What rules? The rules about final pay. The rules about delayed wages. The rules about penalties when a company sits on money it owes. She explained what she could do. A formal demand letter. A request for payroll records. A complaint to the state labor office if Meridian continued to delay. Eddie asked the only question he cared about. "How long before I see the money?" Renata was quiet. "Best case," she said, "a few weeks. If they decide to fight it, longer." Eddie rubbed one hand over his face. He did not swear. He did not ask who he was supposed to be angry at. He already knew. The problem with systems like Meridian's was that they made sure every person you spoke to had just enough distance from the decision to feel innocent. Renata said, "You have savings?" "Some." "For Kezia?" "Yes." She did not tell him to use it. She knew he would if he had to. Kezia's registration deadline was less than 6 weeks away. Eddie said, "Send the letter." Renata said she would. That night, Eddie drove rideshare until almost midnight. His back hurt when he got home. He stood in the dark kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and looked at food he was not hungry enough to eat. Then he saw his route binder in his mind. Not the physical binder, because Meridian had it now, but the years inside it. Mercy General, Harmon, pediatric care, all those mornings. All those people waiting behind receiving doors. The next day, he called Jerome. He did not call to ask for help. He called because Jerome had meant what he said on Eddie's last day, and Eddie wanted to know whether the replacement driver had settled in. Jerome answered on the second ring. Eddie said, "How's the new route going?" There was a pause. Then Jerome said, "What new route?" Eddie felt something tighten in his chest. Jerome explained that the hospitals had received a few inconsistent partial deliveries after Eddie left. Then nothing. No full delivery in 4 days. No return calls from Meridian. At pediatric care, the pharmacy had begun counting the critical items twice a day. At Mercy General, Patricia had started borrowing small quantities from internal reserves and calling other departments with the careful voice people use when they do not want to cause panic before they have confirmed the facts. At Harmon, 2 procedures had already been rescheduled because the medication supply was not where it needed to be. None of the hospitals had announced an emergency. That was not how hospitals worked. They made quiet adjustments first. They checked shelves again. They called suppliers. They borrowed time from wherever they could find it. But Eddie knew the difference between a delay and a pattern. 4 days with no full route meant the problem was not traffic, weather, or a missed call. It meant no one was driving. Eddie asked Jerome for the current numbers. Jerome gave them to him. Then Eddie said, "Call the other 2 facilities. Find out whether they are seeing the same thing." Jerome called back 8 minutes later. They were. By the time Eddie ended that call, the missing check was no longer the largest problem in the story. 3 hospitals had been left without reliable pharmaceutical deliveries. The city was not out of medicine, but 3 facilities were hours away from decisions nobody should ever have to make because a truck did not show up. And Eddie understood something else. The company that had kept his money had also kept his knowledge. It had taken both, treated both as replaceable, and had now discovered that neither one was easy to replace. He looked at the empty kitchen chair across from him. Then he called Renata and told her there was more going on than a wage dispute. Jerome escalated the problem to the Pediatric Care Center's medical director, Dr. Sylvia Park. Dr. Park was not theatrical. She did not need to be. She looked at the inventory report, called the pharmacy team, confirmed the numbers, and asked one question. When is the last safe delivery window? The answer was the next morning. She called Harmon. She called Mercy General. She called Meridian. Meridian's general line went to voicemail. She left a message that named the facts in order. 3 hospitals, 4 days, critical pediatric inventory. No confirmed replacement route. No response from the contracted carrier. The next morning, a Meridian assistant called her back. Not Warren Holt, his assistant. She said there had been a scheduling oversight. She said the company was working on it. She said someone would follow up. Dr. Park said, "I do not need a follow-up. I need a truck." The assistant promised to convey the urgency. At 11, Dr. Park called the State Health Department's emergency operations line. By noon, the state had opened an incident file. By 12:30, Meridian's general counsel had called Warren Holt. For the first time since he had signed the restructuring plan, Holt was told exactly what had happened to the hospital route. He had seen it in a spreadsheet as a line item. He saw it now as 3 facilities: a pediatric medication shortage, state regulators, and a medical director who had documented every unanswered call. The report on his desk had a green transition marker next to the hospital route. Green meant complete. Green meant reassigned. Green meant someone somewhere had checked a box. Holt stared at the word for a moment. and understood that the box had not delivered anything. It had not opened a freight elevator. It had not kept medication cold. It had not shown up at a children's hospital before the shelves ran out. He called operations. "Find a driver," he said. He called operations. "Find a driver," he said. The operations director told him they had no trained replacement who could safely run the route in time. "Use the documentation," Holt said. The operations director asked what documentation. Someone remembered the binder. It was still on the shelf where Eddie had left it 6 weeks earlier. The operations director carried it to his desk, opened the front cover, and began reading. He found the dock codes. He found the elevator warning. He found the pediatric approach diagram. He found the emergency contact list, the cold chain notes, the sequence Eddie used when a receiving bay did not respond, and the names of the people who could solve problems before they became crises. 45 minutes later, he called Holt back. "We need the man who wrote this," he said. Holt asked, "The former driver?" "Yes. Can anyone else run it?" "Not safely today." There was a pause. Then Holt said, "Get me his number." Renata was sitting at Eddie's kitchen table when the call came. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier with takeout containers and printed copies of the demand letter. Eddie had told her about the hospitals. She had listened without interrupting, then said the thing that mattered. "They are going to call you." Eddie looked toward the window. "I know. When they do, you do not give them your answer before you have their terms in writing." He looked at her. "There are people waiting on medication." "I know. That is exactly why you have leverage. You can help them and protect yourself. Those are not opposites." Eddie did not like the word leverage. It sounded like a game played by people who could afford to treat other people's emergencies as bargaining positions. Renata understood that, so she said, "You are not making the hospitals wait. You are making the company stop pretending it can ignore you and still use what you know." Eddie looked down at the demand letter on the table. "What if they send the confirmation and then try to pull something later? Then we have the confirmation, we have the timeline, we have their public health incident. We have more documentation than they wanted you to have." He nodded slowly. Renata reached across the table and tapped the paper once. "You have spent 11 years making sure everybody else had what they needed. Let somebody make sure you do too." At 2:15, Warren Holt called. He introduced himself. His voice was controlled, but Eddie could hear the pressure underneath it. "Mr. Morrow," Holt said, "I understand there has been an issue with your final payment." Eddie said, "There has." Holt said, "We are working to resolve it." Eddie said, "I need written confirmation that it will be resolved before we discuss anything else." Holt paused. Then he said, "I'm also calling because we have a supply situation involving the hospital route. We need someone with your experience to step in today." Eddie looked at Renata. She said nothing. He said, "I understand the situation. I want the hospital supplied. But before I discuss my availability, I need written confirmation of my outstanding wages and every penalty your company owes for delaying them." Holt began to respond. Eddie continued, calm and steady. "The hospitals need a delivery today. I am the person who can make that happen in the time you have left. I am willing to help. I need the payment confirmation first." For several seconds, Holt said nothing. The silence was not anger. It was calculation. Then he said, "I'll have payroll send it within the hour." Eddie said, "Thank you. When I receive it, we can discuss the run." The email arrived 53 minutes later. It confirmed $4,217 in final wages and $1,940 in statutory penalties. $6,157 total. Priority wire transfer within 24 hours. Renata read the document twice. Then she looked at Eddie and said, "It's correct." Eddie called Holt back. "I received the confirmation," he said. "I can take the delivery today under one condition." Holt said, "Go ahead." "I am not returning as an employee. I will do this as an independent contractor. The rate is twice my former per-run rate. You will authorize dock access, distribution pickup, and direct contact with the 3 receiving teams. Holt said, "That's acceptable." Eddie said, "I'll be at the distribution center in 2 hours." After the call, he went into his bedroom and opened the closet. For a second, he stood there looking at the work shirts he had not expected to wear again that week. Then he chose the plain dark jacket he used for cold loading docks, pulled it on, and checked his keys. There was no satisfaction in it, not yet. There was only urgency. For the first time in 11 years, Eddie ran the hospital route in the late afternoon instead of before dawn. The sky was still light when he arrived at the distribution center. The truck was preloaded with the critical shipment, refrigerated medication, emergency supplies, and the items the 3 pharmacy teams had flagged as most urgent. Eddie checked the temperature seals himself. He checked the load order. He checked the route sequence. He did not need the binder. The binder was for someone else. The route itself was already in his hands. At the pediatric care center, Jerome was waiting outside the receiving bay before the truck came into view. He stood there in a visibility vest, arms crossed against the evening air, watching the access road. When Eddie turned the truck through the narrow approach without touching the barrier, Jerome's shoulders dropped. "Eddie," he said. Eddie climbed down from the cab. "Let's get this unloaded." That was all. Inside, the pharmacy team was ready. The cold chain totes moved first. The paperwork moved with them. Jerome's staff logged every item while people in blue scrubs waited just beyond the receiving doors. No speeches, no cameras. Just a truck arriving when it had to. At the side of the receiving bay, one of the pharmacy techs opened the first cold chain tote and checked the seal. Her shoulders loosened when the temperature reading held. That was the real reaction. Not applause. Relief small enough to fit into a breath. At Harmon, Eddie gave the freight elevator 30 seconds. The doors opened. At Mercy General, he knocked 3 times. Patricia opened the receiving door. She had been working an extended shift. Her eyes were tired, but when she saw him, something in her face changed. "You came back?" she said. Eddie handed her the paperwork. "For today," he said. She looked toward the carts. "For today is enough." By the time he finished the route, it was after 10. He drove back to the distribution center, signed the contractor paperwork, and returned to his apartment. The wire transfer cleared the next morning. Eddie paid Kezia's registration fee before he made coffee. Then he paid rent. Then he called Kezia. She was at her mother's apartment when she answered. He told her the fee had been handled. There was a pause. Then she said, "You got it fixed?" Eddie looked at the kitchen window, where the first weak light of morning was beginning to touch the buildings across the street. "Yeah," he said. "It's fixed." He did not explain the hospital crisis. Not yet. She had school. She had exams. She had a future he was trying to protect from adult problems. A week later, Dr. Park submitted the final incident report to the state health department. It did not accuse anyone by name. It did not need to. It documented the facts. A restructuring had removed the personnel responsible for a pharmaceutical delivery route without a continuity plan. A route that existed on paper had stopped existing in reality. 3 hospitals had faced critical supply shortages. The emergency delivery had been completed by the former driver the company had terminated, after the company could not restore the service on its own. The report recommended continuity clauses, knowledge transfer requirements, and designated backup drivers for every future hospital contract. Meridian's general counsel read it. Warren Holt read it. 2 months later, the 3 hospitals rebid the contract. Meridian lost. The new carrier's proposal included a detailed continuity plan. It required an updated route binder, trained backup drivers, quarterly handoff drills, and a named operations contact who could not be removed from the system without someone taking responsibility for the work. The operations director recognized pieces of the plan. They looked very much like the binder Eddie had built on his own time for 11 years. Eddie never returned to Meridian. Warren Holt did call once more. The call was brief. He said the company would be open to discussing a permanent arrangement. Eddie listened. Then he said he appreciated the offer, but he was not interested. He did not explain that some doors close because of anger. Others close because you have learned exactly what is on the other side. He did not want an apology that arrived only after regulators, hospitals, and lawyers made it useful. He took a position with a regional pharmaceutical distributor that paid better and treated root knowledge as part of the job rather than an inconvenience to be ignored. During the contract negotiation, he added one clause. Every year, the company would assign a backup driver to ride the route with him, learn the contacts, review the notes, and update the continuity file. The manager looked at the clause and asked whether that was necessary. Eddie said, "It is." The manager added it. Kezia started the magnet program in September. She liked the science labs. She liked the long bus ride across town. She complained about early mornings in the way 14-year-olds complain about early mornings, even though she secretly liked the quiet part of the apartment before the day got loud. Some mornings, she woke before school and heard her father moving through the kitchen, the coffee maker, the keys, the work boots, the door closing before sunrise. She did not think about supply chains or delivery routes or the city's invisible systems. She only knew that her father got up when the world was dark and went where he was needed. Years later, she would understand that those were not separate things. The city did not know how close 3 hospitals had come to a crisis that week. Most cities do not know the names of the people who keep their essential systems alive. They know the buildings. They know the signs. They know the executive titles. They do not know the driver who knocks 3 times on a receiving door because the buzzer does not reach the back room. They do not know the person who waits 30 seconds for an unreliable elevator. They do not know the worker who records a dangerous turn radius in a binder because nobody else thought to write it down. They do not know the parent who sets aside money one paycheck at a time so a child can attend a better school. They do not know the sister who knows the law well enough to make a powerful company follow it. Until the people who know these things are gone, ignored, or finally forced to speak. Then they become visible. Then the spreadsheets become useless. The plans become incomplete, and the people in charge learn, too late, that the system was never held together by a line item. It was held together by someone who knew what to do. Eddie Morrow had known, and when the city needed him, he came back, not for the company that had refused to pay him, but for the people waiting on the other side of the receiving doors. That was the difference. That was everything. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. All characters, companies, locations, and events are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or institutions is coincidental.